Have Jacob McGill. Jacob's going to talk about the sitting solution, how to offset the problems of a sedentary lifestyle. Jacob woke up from a coma, suffering body and brain trauma, and he's going to share his experience and what he learned out of that process. Please welcome Jacob.
Good morning. How's everybody doing today? Good. So I'm going to play this game a little bit differently today. I mean, it's a small group. It's an intimate audience. It's not just a talk, right? We're both aware this isn't television. If you wanted to just see this talk, you could go somewhere on the internet and just absorb it. So I'm completely open to this being a discussion. If you have any questions as we're going along, anything like that, let's make this time really valuable for everybody involved. Do I have any agreements with that? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So first off, I'll give you a little bit of information about myself and see if I can learn how to work the clicker. Okay. So who here is familiar with the 80-20 rule? Right? You guys have heard of Pareto. What do you know about it? Can you tell me just one thing, one person, quickly as possible? Perfect. Okay, so there's leverage there somewhere, right? Pareto figured this thing out. He's an economist. But if you start doing a little bit of research, if you start deepening the education about the applicability of it, you'll find that it's true everywhere. And people who are smarter than me, mathematicians, physicists, that kind of stuff, can show you on a formulaic level. And I'm here to tell you that there are numerous 80-20 rules towards health. Okay? There's always actually a very simple solution to becoming well. And one of the biggest problems that we have is under your butts right now. Okay? So how do I know this stuff? Well, here's a little bit about me. One more. Second slide. There we go. Okay. So when I was 17, I woke up in the hospital. I'd been in a coma. I'd been in an airlift. I have no recollection of any of this. And I don't even remember the accident. And the brain does that to, get us away from the trauma that we were experiencing at the time. Now, what occurred is simply that I was a young driver, and I was on my way home after school one day, and I panicked after sliding into the ditch and sliding in some gravel. And you should not ever crank the wheel at speed. I mean, that's a lesson right there. It caused the truck to go end over end 3 times. I went about 75 feet, and the biggest piece of trauma, honestly, was what my family went through. Because remember, I was, although conscious for it, no recollection whatsoever from any of it. I mean, I woke up in a hospital bed on a bunch of Demerol a few months later. So it was kind of smooth sailing for me. The thing to get about it is, back to this 80-20 rule, in regards to the medical system, there's a big leverage piece there, and the 20% thing is the ICU, and 80% of the time, they do a really amazing job and they save people's lives. My experience with the medical system is that there was a terminal drop-off at that point, because essentially at the end of my hospital stay, after multiple surgeries and all sorts of other stuff, I got a pat on the head, "You're lucky to be alive" speech, and sent home. And I grew up in a small town in Alberta. There wasn't this massive infrastructure, and really the system hadn't evolved that far yet to do much about the fact that it's like, hey, wait a minute, my arm doesn't go higher than this, right? Post-surgery, because I have a humeral nail in here, all the rest of the plates and material have been removed. I've followed up with physicians and had them extract all the metal that they put into my body over the years, because I've learned other things about how it's foreign, obviously, and something I didn't want to be there. But this is part of what makes me an expert in this field, because I have completely proven wrong every prognosis that I was given about the state of my health, okay? And the system that I was addressed by is static in its nature. So I'm just telling you that it's kind of blameless as far as how they look at things, but how they learn is broken. And that's why this talk is actually about the sitting solution. You can just throw the next slide up for a sec. I mean, this is where I am now. Okay, I'm a black belt in Aikido. I'm a backcountry skier, climber, mountaineer. I've got better posture than pretty much any of you. And it just goes to prove you that it's not static, right? We're actually designed to move and breathe and adapt and all those sorts of things. And after going through about an 8-year process where I got my 10,000 hours, where I learned everything I could about health and well-being, and I did it in terms of applied science, right? I did the work on my own body. I came up with this thing that I call the 100-year plan. You can just throw the next slide up. And so what it is it's a system of leverage. And I just worked with really simple things, like the lowest common denominator, right? If it's the simplest possible answer, it's probably the right answer. So, how did we get here? What's going on? What's the issue with the sitting solution? And why did I start you off with that title? And why am I going to go into it for the rest of this conversation? Well, we're going to start with one of the big triangles here. So you'll notice on the upper left, there's that air, water, food triangle. Anybody want to guess why that's important? Right? No brainer. You cannot live without these things. Okay? Well, here's the issue with sitting, for an example. Okay? We're going to have a little bit of a race, and you two can take on the food game, and you stop eating right now. Okay? And you two stop hydrating right now. Now, I need 2 volunteers to stop breathing. Right? It seems kind of obvious. So that's a conversation I have with my clients. You get a couple weeks, a couple days, and a couple minutes. But there's something else missing here. And that is that out of the 21 muscles that you use to breathe, 20 of those muscles are posture muscles. Now, you're starting to see a little bit of leverage here, right? Like respiration's actually the key to all sorts of stuff. Let's go into this a little bit deeper. Let's have a 30-second anatomy lesson. What's between here and here? Yeah, everything, right? So if you're breathing and you're moving this apparatus the way it's designed, maybe to volume once in a while, right, instead of just that one class Saturday mornings, then what do you get? Everything. And I use this other analogy. I'm not brilliant in this field, but we have this term called homeostasis, which is this blanket thing for everything in life that involves the system working and whatever. And it makes just as much sense as having other experts come into the room and say things like economy, right? Like I'm going to make a blanket statement about economy. What is that? Well, it's this massive pile of systems all interacting in inorganic and organic ways. And can anybody control this, manage it, or half of people even understand it? No. And health is kind of a similar way, but when you look for those lowest common denominators, when we get down to breathing, for example, it gets really simple, and that's where you start to get your leverage. Just throw the next slide up, please. So what's the problem with sitting? Why am I here to lecture about this? This is my groundbreaking discovery after my 10,000 hours, learning about posture, all this sort of stuff. We don't have calluses on our ass. Right? Now, what does that mean? We're not actually designed to sit. It's not what we were made for. Now, if you go back to mitochondria, primordial soup, mitochondria, DNA, development, then there's a cell gets DNA, evolution, evolution, evolution. There wasn't really a place in there where sitting became a part of the process. So what you've got in another triangle, in the brain-body-mind triangle, just throw it up. We've already talked about breathing and air. one more forward, please, is that we start off in this place where we actually functionally know how to move, how to live, how to be, and then we start putting environmental constraints on ourselves. And just throw the next slide up, please. So one of the first environmental constraints that occurs is this situation that we're going to deal with called tension. Okay? Does anybody remember their first day at school? There's this kind of thing that you maybe had dealt with a little bit before, but it was probably one of the first times in your life where from beginning to end you had to sit for this entire period of time. That starts to put tension into our system. If we're meant to move and we're meant to breathe, and each one of these ball and socket joints is actually a lymphatic pump, and respiration is this key to life, and all these things are layered on together because we have hundreds of thousands of years of moving and breathing and operating as a function of life. Isn't it weird that we get to this place one day where we take people and we put them into a chair and we say, we're going to give you information and knowledge, and with that you might be able to get, well, maybe some wisdom with some life experience and possibly a career out of it, but for God's sake, sit still, and ignore what's going on in your lower brainstem, which is natural. It's fidgeting, right? And that's actually our body starting to show us in the beginning that there's a challenge, there's a battle, there's actually a fight for life that starts way back then. And maybe some of you were those kids, or you at least knew some of those kids were the ones that just couldn't sit still. Well, my theory is they had the stronger DNA patterning linked towards survival, right? These are the people who are going to go out and battle zombies for us if things go south, because it's in them. But we have this proprietary rights to life in our system, and we start to ignore it and numb ourselves out of it, and we get bizarre and horrifying statistics. Things like, I read it the other day, it was something like 62% of people in their 30s have low back pain, right? Like, how is that even possible? So this brings up some of the issues that I have about the system that we have, the way that we're taught to learn, and then what we accept as normal from then on, because of course it doesn't just stop at 12 years. If you're smart and fortunate and maybe have access to some capital, live in the first world, that sort of stuff, then you get another 4 years, or another 6 years, another 8 years rewarded sitting opportunities, right? And if you're brilliant and you're going to go and pound those books, I mean, what's the ratio? You're supposed to spend double or triple your classroom time studying in the higher level academia. And I mean, they haven't put treadmills into libraries yet, so what happens there? And so you get these people who come to this certain degree, and some of them have been my clients. I mean, I've got physicians who've come through my door to deal with a scheduled surgery date, and there's this disembodiment going on. They don't actually occupy this container that they live in, and it's just mind-boggling considering they're our go-to experts for well-being, right? So this is, again, my point. Like it's not them or us. It's just that the system's a little bit broken, and we have to go in there and we have to take a deep look at fixing it. So I'm going to reveal a few more pieces here. If you could just forward the next slide. You can kind of see, in terms of kinetic chain, what's going on. This guy over here, and literally there's force and leverage. There's all sorts of stuff going wrong when you put one piece of a kinetic chain out, because our body's intelligent enough to pass the buck. It's not going to let strain fall under one place because that breaks something. So it adjusts. It does that naturally because that's how we get the job done anyway. One of my favorite talks is by this one fellow at McGill University, and he's a physicist and an MD, and he points out this key point. If all you think about is muscle and bone, lever and force, the way a lot of people leave school understanding human kinetics, for example, physics says that if you lift anything heavier than 40 pounds, your discs in your low back should explode under the force. So how does that force get spread out? Well, through systems. Actually through this thing called the lumbar dorsal fascia. So I don't know if you've seen an anatomy book before, but there's this white sheet from the top of the hips to the low ribs. Now, when we get somebody who's in back pain, what's our system's first response? Right? Well, deal with it, numb it, take some pain, do some stretching, get some exercises, go back to work, ignore it for another 5, 10, 15 years. You start to get a back problem. And then our next step is to go through that membrane, to cut a hole in it, to go and do something on the inside. Through this very sheet, this tensile net that's designed to distribute that force. Right? And I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time on the water, but it's never struck me as a good idea to take a gun and shoot a hole through the sail of the sailboat to try and get it to move faster. Right? It's just completely off. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we have to take a look at is our system is kind of backwards, and we don't go in and deal with the brain first and re-educate yourselves at the level of the brain. Because again, we've gone in, we've numbed out the lower brain stem in a way where we just kind of accept sitting as natural and normal. When we were younger, all these signals went off and told us to move. Take the next slide, please. The one thing I'm going to leave you with, just in terms of the thinking of that 80-20 rule, I really want you to take this into consideration, is that on a rehab level, pain is very, very, very rarely the site of the problem. In fact, 98% of the time, it's the site of the compensation pattern. Okay? 1% of the population out there has some sort of a catastrophic failure, like me. 1% of the population out there has some sort of a pathological failure, right? Some sort of disease-oriented thing. I use Lyme disease as an example. Get bitten by a tick, you contract it, affects your health. But 98% of the time, I promise you that the pain that you're feeling is a 5, 10, 15-year-old pattern that has been ignored because our brain normalizes really quickly. And we're also kind of taught and trained to ignore ourselves too, right? Just walk it off. Just walk it off. You're going to be fine. It's just a little sprain. Walk it off. And 5 years later, you're still not walking quite the way you were before the injury. And there's that compounding effect that just spirals out into a problem later on in life. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I do and that I've been taught to do is lock down these kinetic chains. And this is actually the same person, but when she's under weight load and holding her thighs aligned on the Pilates reformer, you'll see the fascia twisting out in the sole of the foot. This is either side of that same string. Go ahead in the next slide, please. So how do we get here? Freeze, flee, and fight. We have this stuff operating all the time, and again, we've chosen to ignore it, not pay attention to it. When you sit properly, next slide, all your weight is balanced on 2 little loony-sized pieces of flesh on that chair. And that's perfect posture. And maybe you've got your spine in the right position, but in 7 to 10 minutes, your brain goes through this decision-making process. Why do we roll comatose people over in bed all the time? Right. Your brain gets it and does not want you to rot. And so you're going to start to slump. You're going to start shifting your posture a little bit in that chair and lose your perfect posture, which doesn't exist in stillness anyway. Posture is dynamic, and that's a complete misnomer, the whole picture that it should be something that's still. That's for statues, not people. But that's where the problem starts. And we get to these places where we start ignoring ourselves. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. So again, we use this system to retrain, and how is actually relatively simple. Flip to the next one, please. And then the last thing that I'm going to tell you is you want to be existing in your body in all 3 planes at all times. So there's circumduction and circumlocution. You've got these ball and socket joints. There's 4 of them. They're not that complicated, and it's just whether or not you work their range of motion on a daily basis consistently throughout that day. Next slide. This one came in. I'm just going to kind of skip it for a moment. There's some simple math in there, but go ahead and pass through this guy. It's joint mobility, flexibility, and range of motion. If you're not doing this daily, you're losing out, and your quality of life is diminishing in the long term. Next one. Now, some brilliant people are starting to think of stuff, and I brought this slide in today because I'm hoping somebody in this room wants to talk afterwards about this hack, because you can start operating your email with your camera, right? So, I mean, I got very interested in this when I was doing some research just 2 days ago, and I stuck this one in here. So this is actually a challenge to connect with somebody. Next one. So, just to end it with you, what to do. How do you get out of this problem, this postural problem where you're stuck and you need a solution? Number one, focus on the bottom first. It's got to be simple, because if it's not, you're not going to do it, right? I'm a human being too. I know what my implementation is like. It's not consistent. But most of all, tasking. The Pomodoro is one of the most brilliant things for your own personal productivity. And if you're breaking your time up in those 25-minute increments, take those 5 minutes and do something, right? Number one, that's the simplest thing I can tell you. We've already got through the 4 major joint systems, how to take on the 3 planes of movement a little bit, and mostly spend less time sitting. Like, do what your body is actually built for. So I'm going to walk off the stage now, and the one thing I'd welcome you to do is, it's in transition, so take a moment and actually get up, at the very least. You know, more complicated, you could spin around twice or do a lap around the room. And start teaching yourself to create that as some sort of a habit. And we're running in these kind of increments all day, so you have the opportunity to just train yourself into that habit by the end of this show. So thank you very much for your time. I'm here for any of your questions, and if there's anything I can do to help you with your health, let me know.